You freeze for a second. Someone across the table looks you in the eye and asks a question that should have a simple answer. Where exactly did Jesus say the words, "I am God, worship me"? You open your mouth because you have heard countless sermons, watched countless debates, and carried assumptions that have felt unquestionable for years. Yet in that moment, your certainty suddenly feels different from your memory. You remember what you have always believed, but you also realize that remembering what you have been told is not the same as remembering what you have actually read. That uncomfortable gap is where many of the deepest questions in life begin. Not because faith is weak, not because doubt is stronger, but because human beings often discover that certainty can feel much larger than the evidence they personally examined. Most people never experience this conflict because they stay inside communities where everyone repeats the same conclusions. Others leave those communities and swing to the opposite extreme, assuming that if one assumption deserves questioning, then everything deserves rejection. Both reactions are understandable, both are deeply human. The real tension begins somewhere in the middle, where you are no longer satisfied with inherited answers, but are not interested in replacing one unquestioned certainty with another. Imagine reading the same pages again, this time pretending you know nothing about 2,000 years of theology, nothing about church traditions, nothing about debates, nothing about denominations, nothing about internet arguments. Imagine meeting Jesus only through the narrative itself. What would you notice first? Would you immediately conclude that he explicitly declared himself to be God, or would you find yourself asking more questions before reaching that conclusion? That possibility alone makes many people uncomfortable because uncertainty feels dangerous whenever identity has been built upon certainty. We like clear lines, we like simple answers, we like feeling that reality can fit inside sentences short enough to repeat. But life rarely gives us that luxury. History certainly does not. Ancient texts almost never do. Before anyone becomes defensive, it is worth recognizing something that often gets lost in arguments. There are sincere believers who are convinced the New Testament presents Jesus as fully divine, pointing not only to individual verses, but to broader themes, titles, actions, and the way early followers understood him. There are also historians and scholars who argue that the question is more complicated, suggesting that explicit formulations developed over time through interpretation, reflection, and theological debate. Simply acknowledging that disagreement exists is not an attack on anyone's faith. It is an invitation to notice how often our confidence arrives before our investigation does. That realization can feel surprisingly personal because it reaches far beyond religion. Think about every opinion you have inherited from parents, teachers, friends, or the culture around you. How many of those ideas became part of you long before you ever examined them? Human beings are extraordinary imitators. We absorb language before we understand grammar. We absorb values before we understand ethics. We absorb beliefs before we understand evidence. None of this means those beliefs are false. It simply means inheritance is not the same thing as investigation. That distinction matters because it changes the emotional experience of asking questions. Suddenly, the goal is not to win an argument. The goal is to understand why different people can read the same material and arrive at dramatically different conclusions. If this question has ever crossed your mind, or if you have ever found yourself reading a familiar passage and wondering whether you were seeing it for the first time, share your perspective below. Whether you strongly agree, strongly disagree, or remain undecided, the conversation itself often reveals more about how people think than about who wins a debate. Consider another familiar experience. Someone recommends a movie and tells you exactly what it means before you watch it. By the time you press play, you are no longer discovering the story. You are searching for confirmation of someone else's interpretation. The same psychological pattern appears everywhere. Expectations shape perception. Labels influence memory. Conclusions influence observation. Once your mind believes it already knows the answer, it quietly stops looking for alternative possibilities. That is not weakness. It is one of the brain's most efficient shortcuts. Yet, shortcuts become dangerous when they replace curiosity. Curiosity is uncomfortable because it refuses to let certainty arrive too early. It keeps asking what else might explain this. What context am I missing? What assumptions am I carrying into the text instead of discovering within it? Those questions are unsettling because they threaten more than information. They threaten identity. For many people, beliefs are connected to family, belonging, purpose, hope, grief, and love. Questioning an interpretation can therefore feel like questioning the people who gave that interpretation to you. That emotional weight explains why conversations about religion often become emotional long before they become logical. We are rarely protecting ideas alone. We are protecting relationships, memories, communities, and parts of ourselves. Perhaps that is why discussions about Jesus continue after so many centuries. The figure at the center of the conversation remains historically influential, spiritually meaningful to billions, and interpreted through different lenses by different traditions. Some readers emphasize direct wording. Others emphasize actions, symbolism, historical context, or the way later communities understood earlier events. None of those approaches can simply be dismissed without careful thought. The deeper challenge is recognizing how quickly our minds search for certainty because uncertainty feels like standing on moving ground. Yet sometimes the most meaningful discoveries begin exactly there, in the uneasy space where we admit that reading carefully is more demanding than repeating confidently. As this journey continues, the question becomes less about winning a theological argument and more about understanding why human beings so often mistake familiarity for understanding. That realization may ultimately be more unsettling than any single conclusion, because once you recognize it in one area of life, you begin noticing it everywhere else. The moment you realize that the biggest debates in history often begin with people reading the same words differently, something inside you changes. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about finding a sentence that settles everything. It becomes about understanding why human beings are so eager for a sentence that settles everything. We crave clarity because clarity feels safe. Ambiguity demands patience, and patience is one of the hardest psychological disciplines to practice. Imagine sitting in a room with 10 people who have all read the same chapter. Every one of them insists they are simply reading what is there. None of them believes they are forcing an interpretation onto the text. Yet they walk away with different conclusions. How is that possible? The answer is uncomfortable, because it forces us to admit that no one approaches a text completely empty-handed. Every reader carries assumptions, expectations, cultural influences, emotional experiences, and questions that quietly shape what stands out and what fades into the background. One person notices titles, another notices actions. Someone else notices historical context, another focuses on language. Each believes they are being objective, while their attention is already being guided by invisible filters they rarely recognize. This is not unique to religion. It happens when people read history, law, literature, politics, and even messages from people they love. Two siblings can remember the same childhood differently because memory is not a recording, it is an interpretation. That realization should not make us cynical. It should make us humble. Humility is often mistaken for weakness, yet it may be the strongest response to questions that have occupied thoughtful people for centuries. It allows someone to say that they hold a conviction while also recognizing why another sincere person might arrive somewhere else. That kind of confidence does not depend on pretending complexity does not exist. It survives complexity. Think about how often certainty grows louder when evidence feels less secure. Human psychology has an interesting habit. When we fear losing something important, we instinctively tighten our grip. Sometimes that helps us preserve what matters. Other times it prevents us from examining it honestly. If your identity is deeply connected to a particular interpretation, even a simple question can feel like a personal attack. The discussion stops being about ideas and starts feeling like a threat to belonging. Yet there is another possibility. What if asking difficult questions is not always the opposite of faith? What if, for some people, it is part of taking their beliefs seriously enough to examine them carefully? Throughout history, many scholars, philosophers, and theologians have wrestled openly with difficult passages instead of pretending they did not exist. They did not all reach the same conclusions, but they shared something important. They believed truth was not harmed by careful examination. That perspective changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Instead of treating questions as enemies, they become invitations to think more deeply. Of course, there is another temptation waiting on the opposite side. Once someone discovers that a familiar belief deserves examination, they may begin assuming that every traditional conclusion must therefore be false. That reaction is understandable, but it mirrors the same psychological shortcut from the opposite direction. Replacing one certainty with another without doing the difficult work of understanding is still avoiding the deeper challenge. Intellectual honesty asks more of us. It asks us to tolerate unanswered questions longer than we would prefer. It asks us to distinguish between evidence, interpretation, tradition, and personal conviction. Those categories overlap, but they are not identical. Recognizing the difference does not force anyone to abandon deeply held beliefs. It simply encourages greater awareness of how those beliefs are formed and defended. If you have ever experienced the strange feeling of rereading something you thought you already understood and discovering details you had overlooked for years, write about that experience below. It does not matter whether it happened with a religious text, a novel, a historical document, or even a conversation with someone you love. Those moments often reveal as much about the reader as they do about the words themselves. The deeper this journey goes, the less it becomes about finding a perfect argument, and the more it becomes about recognizing the remarkable complexity of the human search for meaning. We often imagine that certainty is the destination, yet history repeatedly shows that thoughtful people can share the same desire for truth while disagreeing about how best to understand it. Perhaps that realization is more challenging than any individual claim, because it leaves us with a responsibility that cannot be delegated. We must decide not only what we believe, but why we believe it, and whether our confidence comes from careful reflection, trusted tradition, personal experience, persuasive arguments, or some combination of all of them. That question lingers long after the debate itself ends, and it has a way of following us into every other important decision we make. Eventually, the conversation stops being about a single verse, a single doctrine, or a single conclusion, and becomes something much more personal. You begin to notice that every human being lives inside a story that helps make sense of reality. Those stories give structure to suffering, purpose to sacrifice, hope during uncertainty, and identity in a world that constantly changes. That is why conversations about religion often feel different from conversations about almost anything else. They are rarely just intellectual exercises. They touch the deepest parts of who people believe themselves to be. When someone challenges an interpretation that has shaped your understanding of life, it can feel less like a disagreement and more like the ground shifting beneath your feet. That emotional reaction does not automatically prove that the interpretation is right or wrong. It simply reveals how profoundly beliefs become woven into our identity. This is also why genuine dialogue is so difficult. Most people enter conversations believing they are searching for truth, but beneath the surface they are often searching for reassurance. We naturally prefer information that confirms what we already think. Psychologists describe this tendency in many areas of life, and it affects everyone to some degree. It is not a flaw unique to religious people or skeptical people. It is a deeply human tendency. The believer can fall into it just as easily as the critic. The skeptic can become just as emotionally attached to doubt as the believer becomes attached to certainty. Both can mistake confidence for evidence. Both can stop listening the moment they think they already know the answer. That realization should make all of us slower to judge and quicker to examine our own assumptions. Consider how often people remember debates. Very few remember the strongest argument made by the other side. Most remember the moment they felt emotionally threatened or intellectually affirmed. Memory itself becomes selective. We notice what reinforces our existing worldview and quietly ignore details that complicate it. That is one reason ancient texts continue to generate new discussions across generations. Readers bring new questions, new experiences, new historical knowledge, and new perspectives. The text remains the same, but the people reading it do not. Some conclude that the broader narrative strongly supports Jesus' divinity. Others conclude that later theological development plays a significant role in how those passages are understood today. Still others find themselves somewhere in between, convinced that the historical and theological questions are more nuanced than either extreme admits. None of these positions disappears simply because someone speaks with greater confidence. Confidence and certainty are not the same as demonstration. History repeatedly reminds us that sincere, intelligent, and well-informed people can disagree for centuries without either side disappearing. That fact alone should encourage humility. Humility does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing the limits of our own perspective and the possibility that understanding often grows through continued reflection rather than instant certainty. Perhaps the most important question is not whether someone can recite an argument from memory, but whether they are willing to examine why that argument feels persuasive in the first place. Is it because they have investigated it carefully? Because trusted people taught it? Because it fits naturally with their broader worldview? Because it answers emotional needs that every human being carries? There is nothing shameful about asking those questions. In fact, they may be among the most honest questions a person can ask. They invite us to look not only at the ideas we defend, but also at the reasons we defend them so passionately. If this discussion has challenged one of your assumptions, whether it strengthened your existing view or made you reconsider part of it, share that experience below. The goal is not to declare winners or losers, but to understand how thoughtful people wrestle with difficult questions. Some of the most meaningful conversations begin when people explain not only what they believe, but how they arrived there. That journey often reveals far more than a final conclusion ever could. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson is that the search for truth demands both courage and patience. Courage to ask difficult questions without assuming that every question destroys faith. Patience to resist easy answers simply because they provide immediate comfort. Whether someone ultimately concludes that Jesus explicitly claimed divinity, implicitly revealed it, or believes the evidence points in another direction altogether, the process of examining those questions carefully can deepen intellectual honesty and mutual understanding. The value of that process does not depend on everyone reaching the same destination. It depends on approaching one another with enough integrity to distinguish between what we know, what we infer, what we inherit, and what we continue to explore. In a world that rewards certainty and speed, choosing thoughtful reflection may be the most radical decision of all, because it reminds us that the search for meaning is not merely about arriving at answers. It is also about becoming the kind of person who is willing to keep asking better questions,